Hi everyone, I'm Shaylin here with Reedsy. Today we're going to be talking about choosing the point of view of your story. Point of view is one of my favorite topics within writing, so I'm so excited to be talking about it. I think it's something so interesting, even though from the outside it might seem kind of bland or technical, it's actually really fascinating. Point of view is essentially the place, person, and perspective the story is being told from. Where is your story coming from? That's why it's such an interesting and complex decision. It's kind of the angle that we're going to be looking at the story. So this means who's telling the story, when they're telling the story, and how they're telling the story. So point of view is much more than just the pronoun that we're primarily going to see, whether it's a first person pronoun like I, or a third person pronoun like he, she, or they, or even a second person pronoun like you. It's also the lens we see the story from and how the story is filtered and conveyed to the audience. Point of view is an important decision. First of all, it's very hard to change after the fact. Changing a point of view is really quite difficult. So it's something you do want to think carefully about beforehand. I want to say really clearly, if there's one takeaway from this video, is that there's no universally better point of view, and no point of view is universally more difficult to write. There's only point of views that are going to be more beneficial or less beneficial for specific stories, and although you will hear some people say that certain point of views are better in general, it's simply not true. So think of point of view as the angle the story is being told from. We can see a story from multiple angles, and some stories can be seen effectively from multiple angles. The story will just kind of seem like a different story. But there are also certain stories where seeing it from a specific angle is going to reveal the most about the story, is going to be the most effective. So there are definitely stories out there where you could tell it effectively from multiple points of view, and others where you really need a specific one to tell it effectively. It just depends on the piece. But I really want to make it clear that point of view isn't just a choice, it's actually a very flexible tool. It's not something you choose, it's more something that you construct. Every use of first person will be different, even if they fall under that umbrella of first person. You have to build your specific use of first person depending on the parameters of your specific story. So keep in mind as I'm going through the rest of the point of views in this video that this choice isn't about just picking one. It's about building the point of view that's going to best suit your story. So this means paying attention to where the story is being told from and when the story is being told from, how the story is being told, as in what form, like verbally, just in the character's mind, written down, to another person, to a known audience, just how aware the narrator is of the audience and their attitudes towards the audience and who they think that audience is, why the narrator is telling the story, if that's applicable, what the rules of the point of view are regarding things like omniscient, and what knowledge the narrating character has. So what should you consider when you're choosing the point of view of your story? First of all, know that some point of views are common and standard to specific genres. It doesn't mean you have to use them, but you should understand why they're conventions and therefore why you may want to deviate from those conventions. For example, it would be very unusual to find a mystery novel with an omniscient narrator, because by nature, mystery novels are about not knowing. They're about going along with the main character, figuring out the mystery as we go. So an omniscient narrator, a narrator who knows everything, wouldn't be too useful in this genre. Along with that, YA novels are most often in first-person present tense because that's the point of view that most closely emulate the natural speaking voice of a teenager in that kind of close confessional personal style. You'll often see epic fantasy in third person limited or third person omniscient because that suits the larger scope of those stories. So if you're writing in a genre with a clear point of view trend, start by looking at that point of view trend and asking yourself, will this work for my story, or do I want to subvert that somehow? So all of that out of the way, let's talk about the different point of views. First up, let's start with first person. First person is told through an I. So basically, a character is telling the story themselves. This means that they are conscious of the fact that storytelling is taking place. A first-person narrator will be inherently biased, although to different degrees. You can check out our video on unreliable narrators if you'd like to learn more about that, but it's kind of impossible for a first-person narrator to be without bias because it's just inherent to being a person. First-person narratives typically feel close and personal because we're being told a story directly by the character, usually with an inherently close psychic distance, aka how close the narrative is to the character. This is why people often say that first-person stories feel the most intimate, and it does make sense. It's kind of like we've sat down with the character and they're telling us the story directly. It's important to keep in mind in first person that information as well as structure is limited to what the character knows and how the character perceives the story. A first-person narrator is typically the protagonist, but they don't have to be. There is a specific technique known as first-person witness, where the narrating character is not the protagonist. First person is a very widely used point of view. It's very natural to read, it feels personal and conversational, and it also most closely emulates how we tell stories in our day-to-day lives. Typically, if we're telling a story about something that happened to us, to a friend, we're going to be telling it in first person. First person is often not well suited to stories with very large scope or with many point of views because the limits of what a first person character knows might not be capable of conveying such a vast story. But of course, it depends on the narrator. As well, it might not be that useful in a story where the narrator is inherently unreliable, but you don't want them to be. Let's say you have a character who's just really unreliable, they're just not a trustworthy person, and if they were telling the story in first person, they would lie all the time, and they wouldn't portray the story accurately. But that's not what you want. You want the story to be told in a more accurate sense. First person might not be too beneficial. On the other hand, if you want to write an unreliable narrator, first person is such a great point of view to do that. It also really allows you to lean heavily into voice. So if you want to lean very heavily into the voice of a character and create a really rich or specific voice, first person is a great option. So let's talk about second person, kind of the black sheep of the family, a bit of a rarer point of view, but one that I admittedly love and wish was more popular. I find it really fun to write and to read, and I'd actually really encourage writers to experiment with it. This is where the story is told from a you pronoun. Now, sometimes this does mean that the reader is meant to be the narrator, but more often than not, it means that the protagonist is telling the story to themselves. So the you is a character, and it's just the main character talking to themselves. It's a very common misconception that second person means the reader is the narrator, and I actually think that this misconception is why so many people don't like the point of view. If you ask people why they don't like second person, most people say the reason they don't like second person is because it's telling them they would do things that they would never do. But this is often a misunderstanding of what second person means. It rarely means that the you is actually you as the reader. The you is the character just talking to themselves. The reason for this is because the protagonist might be dissociating from themselves because the events are very difficult to talk about, or maybe even very traumatic to talk about. Or they need to kind of instruct themselves through a situation. There are lots of reasons why a character might need to create a disconnect between themselves, and they might do that by using second person. That's why this point of view is really effective at conveying very powerful emotion. This is a very intense point of view, so if you choose to use it, make sure your story can withstand that, and make sure you have a strong and clear reason for using it. Unfortunately, many readers, as well as people who work in publishing, still have a pretty strong negative bias towards second person, and it's because of this the reader is the main character misconception. It's kind of unfortunate that so many people feel off-put by this point of view for something that's actually not correct. But because of all of this, if there's no clear reason, it's very hard to get the reader on board. And it'll feel like you're just using second person to be edgy or different. It is hard to execute well. A big part of that is just because we have less exposure to second person than other point of views, so it feels less natural to a lot of readers. So because of that, it does require very careful execution. Second person is often heavily tied to a piece's theme because of this, because it kind of needs to be really justified in the narrative in order to be used. No one's really going to question if a story is in first person, but they will question if it's in second person. Usually if you're using second person, it's because it's revealing something about the narrative or the character. If you're interested in second person, I definitely recommend experimenting with short stories first before committing to a whole novel. Now on to third person. So there are three different types of third person: objective, limited, and omniscient. Objective is very rarely used, so you might actually never encounter it, but essentially it means that the third person narrator doesn't have access to any character's thoughts. They're kind of like a camera who can only see what's happening externally. It's what screenplays are written in, but you'll almost never see it in fiction. Occasionally, but it's very rare. So let's focus more on the two types of third person that you'll most commonly see. And the most common type of third person is third person limited. This is where we can only go into one character's mind at a time. Think of the narrator as being attached to and kind of blended with one character. Even though the story is told through what feels like an outside lens, you still are internal to that narrating character. It's kind of like the third person narrator is like a spirit that is attached itself to one character at a time. It's going to help them feel through the story and tell the story, but it still is the main character. It's a little difficult to wrap your mind around. Third person is great for a character who might not have the ability or desire to tell the story in first person. In first person, there's kind of that active element where the character is choosing to tell the story. Third person is great for a character where that wouldn't make sense, or for a character where that ability to control distance from them a little more would be beneficial. It's important to know that in third person, your story can definitely feel as close to the character as in first person. It's kind of a misconception that first person feels inherently closer. It's more so that in third person, there are more pitfalls that a writer can fall into that distance the story from the character. A lot of the time in third person, we might not get enough of the character's feelings, or we might not get enough of the character's thoughts, and it might feel too objective, but this isn't inherent. It's totally possible to write a third person story that feels as close to the character as in first person. This is a very popular point of view, and for good reason. It's not obtrusive and has many of the same benefits as first person, but with more ability to control distance within the narrative, since you're not as tied down to structure as your first person narrator would experience it. Know though that it's very difficult to write an unreliable narrator in third person. The character doesn't know that a story is being told, so they can't really lie. They're not consciously telling the story, so it's very hard for them to purposely lie to the reader because they don't know they're lying. Typically, if you want to write an unreliable character, you probably want to do so in first person, although you can still achieve a type of unreliability where the character's perception is off even to themselves and they're kind of lying to themselves. However, if you want to have a character who's like consciously withholding from the reader, or consciously lying from the reader, that's going to be very difficult to pull off in third person. This is also a great point of view choice for stories with multiple point of views, since the switch from point of view to point of view is going to feel much more organic than in first person. Finally, let's talk about third person omniscient. This is where the third person narrator has access to every single character's thoughts. Their scope of knowledge is basically unlimited. They could tell you literally anything about anyone in the history of the world. They know what's happening at any point on Earth at all times. Doesn't mean they necessarily have to show us everything that's happening on Earth at all time, but they do have the potential to do so. This allows you unlimited scope and unlimited access to information, which sounds great, but think about it before you dive into the allure. It can be pretty difficult to pull off, and it's not always the most beneficial. It's great for stories with huge sprawling casts and a lot of information that would be hard to convey organically in a limited point of view, but make sure you handle those point of view shifts carefully. They can be kind of jarring. It's common for a third person omniscient narrator to kind of become a character themselves and actually gain a bit of a personality themselves, whereas in third person limited, usually the narrator is very closely the character, just from a slightly different viewpoint. In third person omniscient, because we're dealing with so many point of views simultaneously, that narrator has to kind of be a persona of their own. Sometimes this is very defined and they have like their own personality. Sometimes it's more subtle. So this is a great point of view if you need to do a lot of world building that's maybe deeper than your characters can provide, or if you want the readers to have information that the characters don't. So to review, remember that point of view is a very flexible aspect of storytelling. So in the end, don't feel limited by anything. If you don't know where to get started, you can study point of view conventions in your genre, but know that these aren't rules. They've just evolved because certain point of views work better in certain genres most of the time. First person is a great choice if you want to work with a strong voice or with a character who's unreliable. But remember that in this point of view, you're limited to what your narrator perceives and have to structure the story in the way they perceive it as well. Second person is fairly uncommon, but can be very effective in experimental fiction and is usually used to mean that the narrator is speaking to themselves. Third person limited is a very popular point of view and gives you a lot of control over the narrative. It also works ideally for a book with multiple point of views because it can make the point of view shifts less jarring, or for a book with a lot of world building context or information. Finally, third person omniscient gives you access to unlimited information. You can also take the technique of characterizing the narrator, either subtly or overtly, if that works with the theme and form of your story. So that is an intro to the different point of views. What point of view is your current novel in? I actually do not want to say what point of view my current novel is in because it is so ridiculously complicated, but let's just say that it's second person. It's like a variant of second person and it's over the top and ridiculous. But the other book I'm writing is just a first person past tense narrative and it's nothing too wacky or out there. But I would love to hear what you are currently writing in. Thank you so much for watching. Remember to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any new videos from us. We've got new writing, editing, and publishing tips every Tuesday and Friday. Until next time.